The stone floor hit his back so hard it knocked the wind out of him. Dan Crow opened his eyes and saw the ceiling. High, vaulted, with cracks in the plaster and soot marks from torches. This wasn't the ceiling of a hospital room, nor was it the ceiling of his pickup truck's cab. He clearly remembered the icy M6 highway. He remembered how the steering wheel jerked to the left. He remembered the headlights of the truck. Then nothing. And now a ceiling with torches. He sat up. The coveralls he was wearing were his own, orange with the company logo on the left pocket. The thermal underwear underneath was his too. His hard hat lay on the floor beside him. The tablet in his chest pocket was pressing against his ribs. Dan raised his right hand and looked at his thumb, the scar from the drill bit. White, old. His scar. His hands. His body. Standing before him was a man in a gold-embroidered doublet with a face the color of sour milk. Behind this man stood another 24 people in clothing that Dan had only ever seen in museums and in pictures from medieval history textbooks. Someone in the back rows giggled. The man in the doublet unfurled a scroll and began to read. His voice was both raspy and solemn. Dan understood every word, even though the language wasn't English. The words simply fell into his mind as if they were his own. The decree stated that His Majesty King Vallenheim, in his infinite wisdom and mercy, bestowed the title of Baron of Greyhold to a certain Daniel Crow, a foreigner who had appeared by the will of Providence. Someone in the hall coughed. Someone giggled again. The man in the doublet rolled up the scroll and looked at Dan with an expression that was somewhere between disgust and pity. Dan stood up. His knees creaked. 34 years and 10 years on the watchtowers had taken their toll. He looked around. A throne room. A real throne room with stone columns and tapestries on the walls. The throne was empty. Apparently, the king hadn't deemed it necessary to be present in person for the conferral of this joke of a barony. Thoughts lined up in order, as they always do in emergencies. First thought, I'm dead. Second thought, this doesn't feel like death. Third thought, I've just been granted a fief. Fourth thought, I have a tablet with geophysical logs in my pocket and 30 years of engineering experience in my head. Fifth thought, they have no idea what they just did. He bowed. Precisely. 30 degrees. No more, no less. He thanked the crown in a calm, even voice. The man in the doublet blinked. Apparently, he had expected a different reaction, confusion, tears, or pleas. Dan turned and walked toward the exit. A guard in chainmail holding a spear stood by the door. Dan stopped next to him and asked where the nearest stream was and if there was a blacksmith in the barony. The guard replied without thinking. The stream is behind the eastern wall. There's a blacksmith, but he's drinking. Dan nodded and walked out. Greyhold turned out to be exactly as it had been described to him on the way from the capital. A rocky plateau, a gray sky, a wind with a hint of dust. The road, washed out by rain, led down to a cluster of houses from which thin smoke rose. The castle stood on a hill, though it could only be called a castle out of politeness. 2 towers, one of which was cracked right down the middle. A wall 4 meters high with a gap in the northern section that had been patched with logs. A courtyard overgrown with weeds. 3 guards sat by the gate, sharing a piece of stale bread among the 3 of them. Dan walked through the gate. The guards looked up. One of them stood up and asked who he was. Dan said he was their new baron. The guard looked at the orange jumpsuit. He looked at the helmet. He looked at the faces of his 2 comrades. He sat back down. He said the previous baron had been better dressed. Inside the castle, it was cold and empty. The throne room was the size of a garage. The kitchen had 3 pots on a shelf and a single spoon lying on the floor. The bedroom had a bed with a hole in the mattress. The study had an empty desk and a single chair. A man was sitting in the chair, old, bald. His face was covered with wrinkles like a map of river valleys. He stood up when Dan entered and introduced himself. Hamish, the steward of Greyhold. He spoke slowly and with difficulty, like a man who's used to his words making no difference but speaks anyway. Hamish told him everything. 340 people, 80 guards, 40 of whom hadn't eaten properly in 2 months. The treasury was empty. The wells had run dry 6 years ago. Water was hauled from a stream 2 miles away. There was no ether ore. 3 mages, scout mages from the academy, had come in different years, and all 3 said the same thing. There's nothing beneath Greyhold, nothing but rock. There's no trade. The harvest lasts only until midwinter, and then they start slaughtering their last goats. In 5 months, the royal tax is due. They have nothing with which to pay. If they don't pay, the barony will pass to Count Rothmar Valancourt. The Count has already sent messengers twice with an offer to buy the title. Hamish fell silent and looked at Dan with that look Dan had seen hundreds of times on oil rigs in Africa, the look of a man who doesn't believe anyone has come to help, but still holds out hope. Dan sat down on the edge of the table. He took out his tablet. The screen lit up, 23% battery. He opened the latest logs from the Pierce 7 platform. Drilling data from the North Sea. Useless here. But his habit of working with data had proven useful everywhere. He closed the logs and looked at Hamish. He asked if there was a map of the area in Greyhold. Hamish shook his head. He asked if there was anyone who knew the area by heart. Hamish said he himself knew every rock. Dan nodded and said that tomorrow at dawn they would go out to survey the terrain. Hamish asked why. Dan replied that he wanted to understand what was beneath their feet. Hamish said there was rock beneath their feet and nothing else. The mages had checked. Dan replied that the mages were looking for one thing, but he would be looking for another. Hamish left. Dan was left alone in the office. He took off his overalls and hung them on the back of a chair. He sat down on the floor because he didn't want to lie down on the bed with its sagging mattress. He pulled a pencil stub, which he always carried with him, out of his pocket. He tore a sheet of thick paper from the tablet case, and he began to write. A list. First, water. Without water, nothing will happen. We need to find an aquifer. The locals dug to 2 meters and gave up. 2 meters is nothing. Artesian water could be at 15, at 20, at 30. I need to read the rock. Second, a blacksmith. Without a blacksmith, there are no tools. Without tools, there's no drilling. Third, people. I need at least 10 pairs of working hands. Fourth, food. Hungry people don't work. He needed to find a way to feed the crew for at least a month ahead. He finished writing the list and tucked the paper into his pocket. He lay down on the stone floor. The cold crept up his back. Somewhere beyond the wall, the wind howled. Through a crack in the window, he could see the sky. A foreign sky. Not a single familiar constellation. Dan closed his eyes. He thought of his daughter. Emily must be 9 by now, or maybe 10 already. He'd missed her birthday last year because of his shift. Now he'd miss all the rest. His throat tightened. He swallowed. He opened his eyes. He looked up at the unfamiliar sky. He said one word aloud. All right. And he closed his eyes again. At dawn, he was already standing at the gate. His coveralls were zipped up. His hard hat was on his head. In his hand was a stick he'd picked up by the wall. Hamish arrived 10 minutes later. He looked at the hard hat. He didn't say anything. They set off. Dan walked and looked, not at the houses, not at the people, at the ground, at the rocks, at the cracks in the exposed rock by the roadside, at the color of the soil, at how the grass grew, where it was greener, where it was yellower, where there was none at all. He would stop and sniff the soil. Hamish watched him in silence. Once, Dan got down on one knee and licked a rock. Hamish opened his mouth, closed it, said nothing. By noon, they had walked halfway around the plateau. Dan stopped at the eastern slope where a thin trickle of water was seeping from a crack in the granite. He touched the water with his finger, tasted it, looked at the slope, at the crack, at the direction in which it was flowing beneath the rock. He took out a piece of paper and drew a line, then a second, then a third. Hamish stood nearby and waited. Dan said there was water beneath the eastern slope, a lot of water. Hamish said the mages had already checked. Dan replied that the mages were looking for ether, but he was looking for water, and those were two different things. Hamish said nothing, but his eyes narrowed slightly, not out of distrust, because of something else, because of a tiny spark that hadn't yet become hope, but had already ceased to be emptiness. They returned to the castle. An old man was waiting for them at the gate, thin, hunchbacked, with hands that trembled with a slight quiver. He was a miller. His name was Aldrich. He had come to the new baron with a request. 6 years ago, his well had run dry. His wife carried water from a stream 2 miles away, every day, back and forth, 4 miles with a yoke on her shoulders. She was coughing up blood. Aldrich spoke softly and kept his eyes downcast. He wasn't asking, he was stating a fact, like a man who had long since stopped asking because asking was useless. Dan looked at him, then he said one sentence. "Show me your yard." Aldrich's yard was small and crooked, a gray stone house with a sagging roof, a shed behind which wormwood grew. Dan walked around the property in a circle, slowly, stopping every 3 steps. He looked at the ground, at the cracks, at where the wormwood was thicker, at where the stone was darker. Hamish stood by the gate and watched. Aldrich stood nearby, shifting from foot to foot, and said nothing. Dan approached a crack in the granite behind the shed. He crouched down, he sniffed. Then he took out a stick and poked at the crack. The stick went in easily, too easily for solid rock. He turned to Aldrich and asked if it smelled here after the rain. Aldrich said it did, like dampness and iron. Dan asked where the snow melted first in the winter. Aldrich pointed. "Right here, by the shed, always first." Dan nodded. He stood up. He dusted off his knees and said they needed to dig right here. 12 elbows down. When they hit clay, not to be alarmed. Dig another 3 elbows. There would be sand and water there. Aldrich looked at him. Then he looked at Hamish. Hamish shrugged. Aldrich looked at Dan again. He asked how he knew. Dan replied that the snow melts first where the ground is warmer. The ground is warmer where water is moving beneath it. Wormwood grows in moist soil. A crack in the granite is a path through which water rises but doesn't reach the surface because the top layer is too dense. Break through it, and the water will flow. Aldrich listened. He didn't understand, but his eyes were like those of a drowning man who sees a rope. It doesn't matter where it comes from. What matters is that it's there. The next morning, Aldrich and 2 of his neighbors began digging. Dan stood nearby and watched. The rock was hard to break through, granite, then clay shale. At a depth of 6 cubits, they hit red clay. Aldrich stopped and looked up. Dan told him to keep digging. At the 8th cubit, the clay became wet. At the 10th, water began to flow. Murky, reddish. Aldrich cursed. Dan said it was surface water and they needed to go deeper. At the 12th cubit, the clay ended and sand began. Gray, coarse, and water gushed out of the sand. Clear, cold. It filled the pit in a matter of minutes and rose 3 cubits from the bottom. Aldrich stood knee-deep in the water and didn't move. Then he cupped his hands, scooped up some water, brought it to his face, drank it, and began to cry. Not quietly, out loud, like a child. His neighbors stood above and watched. Hamish stood by the gate and watched. Dan stood next to Hamish and said nothing. Aldrich climbed out of the pit. He walked over to Dan. He grabbed his hand and pressed his forehead against it. Dan gently pulled his hand away. He said they needed to line the walls with stone so they wouldn't crumble, and that he'd send someone to help. By evening, the whole of Greyhold knew about Aldrich's well. The village had 340 people. In a village, news travels faster than the wind. People came to look. They touched the water. They tasted it. They shook their heads. Someone said it was magic. Dan heard this and replied that it wasn't magic, it was geology. No one understood what geology was, but they remembered the word. On the 5th day, the blacksmith came to see Dan, Finn, broad-shouldered, red-haired, with hands the size of shovels. He smelled of smoke and ale. He said he'd heard about the well. He said he didn't believe in miracles, but believed what he saw with his own eyes. He asked what the Baron needed from a blacksmith. Dan looked at him. Then he took out a piece of paper and drew a picture, a chisel, a rod, a striking mechanism, and a rope drum. He explained how it worked. A heavy chisel falls into the borehole and shatters the rock. The rope pulls it back up. It falls again. It shatters the rock again. A simple machine that strikes the rock over and over, reaching deep down where a shovel could never go. Finn stared at the sketch for a long time. Then he said it was heresy. Then he said it was beautiful heresy. Then he asked what the pick should be made of. Dan said the best iron they had. Finn said the best iron had gone to the county stablemaster's horseshoes 3 months ago. Dan said they'd make their own, better. Behind Finn, standing in the doorway, was a girl, broad-shouldered, with calloused hands and hair tied back with a leather strap. Her face was smudged with soot. Her eyes were just like her father's. It was Rowan. She didn't introduce herself. She just stood there and listened. When Dan finished explaining, she asked how much the chisel weighed. Dan gave her a number. She nodded. She said she could forge it in 4 days if they had coal. Finn looked at his daughter, then at Dan. He didn't say anything, but the corners of his mouth twitched. Coal was a problem. In Greyhold, they burned peat and dry manure. Peat burned weakly and gave off little heat. For forging, they needed proper coal. Dan knew there was coal here. He'd seen signs of it on the eastern slope, dark veins in the rock outcrops, a distinctive sheen. But they had to reach the coal seam. And to reach it, they needed a drill. And to make a drill, they needed a blacksmith. And a blacksmith needed coal. A vicious circle. Dan sat in his office and thought for 2 hours. Then he stood up and went to see Hamish. He asked if there were any outcrops of bituminous coal in the area. Hamish said that on Count Valancura's estate there was a mine 20 miles to the south. Dan asked if he could buy coal from the Count. Hamish laughed. It was a grim laugh. The Count wouldn't sell Greyhold even a candle stub. Dan nodded. He thought about it some more. Then he asked what if, instead of buying from the Count, he found those who transport coal from the Count's mine further north. Buy it from them along the way. Hamish fell silent. Then he said there was an inn on the northern road. Caravans pass through there. The innkeeper is a greedy man, but not a fool. Dan asked how much money was in the till. Hamish said 14 silver coins and a handful of copper coins. Dan closed his eyes. 14 silver coins. In this world, that money would buy 1 skinny goat, or 2 sacks of flour, or 10 pounds of coal. Nothing more. He stepped out into the courtyard. He looked at his coveralls. Orange, with stainless steel snaps, with zippered pockets, with reflective fabric patches. The fabric was thick, waterproof. In this world, such fabric didn't exist. He took off the coveralls, folded them neatly, and carried them to Hamish. "Sell this," he said. Hamish took the coveralls in his hands. He felt the fabric. He looked at the fasteners. His eyes widened. He said that in the capital, they'd give 3 gold pieces for fabric like that and fasteners like those, maybe 4. Dan said he didn't need gold in the capital. He needed coal on the northern road. Hamish said he'd take care of it. 2 days later, a wagon loaded with coal arrived in Greyhold. 400 pounds. Hamish sold the overalls to the innkeeper for a sack of coal and 2 sacks of barley flour. The innkeeper had marked up the price 3-fold. Hamish knew that. Dan knew that. But the coal was in the smithy, and Rowan was already stoking the bellows. Rowan had been working for 4 days straight. She slept in the smithy on a bench against the wall. She ate there, too. Finn brought her bread and water, and each time he shook his head as he looked at the blueprints Dan had pinned to the beam above the anvil. The chisel turned out heavy and rough, but sturdy. Dan picked it up. He turned it over in his hands. He checked the edge with his fingernail. He looked at Rowan. He said the edge was good. Rowan wiped her face with her sleeve and didn't say anything, but her back straightened by half an inch. The bar was made from an oak log bound with iron strips. The rope drum was assembled from a wagon wheel. The rope was braided from ox tendons and hemp. The frame stood on 4 posts driven into the ground on the eastern slope, where Dan had seen dark veins in the rock, where, according to his calculations, coal lay beneath a layer of granite and shale. The whole structure looked like the drunken skeleton of a giant, but it stood. And when 10 men pulled on the rope and the drill bit rose 3 meters, then crashed down with a dull thud against the rock, Dan felt something shift inside him. A familiar sound, the sound of drilling, the sound of work. They covered the first 2 meters in a day. The granite crumbled slowly. The pickaxe head dulled. Rowan resharpened it every evening. At the 3rd meter, they hit shale, softer, faster. At the 5th meter, Dan stopped working and lowered a bucket on a rope into the hole. He pulled it up. He looked at what had stuck to the bottom. Dark rock with an oily sheen. He rubbed it between his fingers. He sniffed it. And he smiled. For the first time in 10 days in this world. Hamish was standing nearby. He asked what it was. Dan said it was a promise. Hamish didn't understand. Dan said that there was most likely a coal seam at that depth, and if he was right, Greyhold would no longer have to rely on imported fuel. Hamish looked at the black crumbs in Dan's hands. Then he looked at the drilling rig. Then he looked at Dan. And for the first time, he didn't twirl his finger against his temple. He just stood there in silence, like a man afraid to believe it. At the 7th meter, the drill bit got stuck. Dan climbed down into the well and spent 2 hours trying to pull it out. His hands were bloodied from the rope. Rowan approached. Silently, she took his hands. She examined them. She left. She returned with a rag and goose-fat ointment. She bandaged them. She didn't say a word. Dan said thank you. Rowan muttered something indistinct and went back to the anvil. At the 9th meter, the borehole hit a coal seam. Dan could tell by the color of the drilled rock, black, dense, with a characteristic conchoidal fracture. He picked up a piece and held it to the fire. The rock caught fire, evenly, hot, with a bluish flame. It wasn't brown coal. It was bituminous coal, coking coal, the very kind that could produce enough heat to melt iron. Dan sat down on the ground next to the borehole and stayed there for about 5 minutes. He just breathed. Then he stood up and walked over to Hamish. The Greyhold Council convened that same evening. 7 elders sat at a long table, with Hamish presiding. Dan stood before them, holding a piece of coal in his hand. He placed it on the table. He said he had found a coal seam at a depth of 9 meters. He said that, according to preliminary estimates, the seam stretched several hundred meters along the eastern slope. He said there was enough coal to last for decades. The elders looked at the piece of coal. One picked it up. He sniffed it. Another asked what to do with it. Dan explained. This coal burns 5 times hotter than peat. You can smelt iron with it. You can sell it. It's worth money, real money. 3 of the 7 old men nodded. 2 remained silent. 2 were against it. One of them said that the barren was digging holes and wasting people's time on nonsense instead of repairing the walls and preparing for winter. Dan listened. Then he asked what this old man planned to use for heat this winter. The peat, of which there was only a month's supply left, or manure from the goats, of which there were only 12 left. The old man fell silent. Dan said that in 2 weeks he would begin mining. In a month, every house in Greyhold would have coal, for free. The council didn't vote. Hamish simply nodded. That was enough. Mining began not in 2 weeks, but in 3. The shaft was too narrow for normal coal extraction. Dan dug a tunnel. A horizontal tunnel in the hillside at the level of the coal seam. 10 men with pickaxes and shovels. Wooden supports made of oak logs. Ventilation through a second shaft driven from above. Dan designed everything himself. He drew it out on paper. He explained to each worker what to do and why. He didn't give orders, he explained. People listened. At first with skepticism, then with interest, then with that look on their faces that Dan knew better than anything else in the world, the look of people who realized their work had meaning. In the middle of the third week, a horseman rode up to the gates of Greyhold, a young man dressed for travel, with a coat of arms on his cloak, the coat of arms of Count Valancourt. The horseman delivered a letter. Hamish read it aloud at the council meeting. Count Rothmar Valancourt, in refined terms, reported that he had heard of the difficulties faced by the new Baron of Greyhold and offered his assistance. He was prepared to take Greyhold under his protection in exchange for the right to extract all resources found within the barony's territory. The wording was polite. The meaning was simple. Hand over everything you've found, or there will be trouble. Dan listened to the letter. He asked for a pen and paper. He wrote a reply. He thanked the Count for his concern. He informed him that Greyhold was managing on his own. He wished the Count good health and a successful hunt. He sealed the letter. He handed it to the horseman. The rider rode off. Hamish looked at Dan. He said the Count wasn't used to being turned down. Dan replied that neither was he. The first ton of coal came out of the tunnel on the 26th day. Dan stood at the entrance and counted the wheelbarrows. Each wheelbarrow held about 40 pounds, 25 wheelbarrows per shift. Not much, but enough to start with. The coal was dumped into a stone-lined pit at the foot of the hill. By evening, the pit was full, a shiny black mountain. People came up and touched it as if they couldn't believe it was real. Dan ordered the coal to be distributed to the homes, for free, 2 buckets per family. Hamish said it was a waste. Dan replied that it was an investment. Hamish didn't know that word. Dan explained. You give people warmth. People stop thinking about how to survive. They start thinking about how to live. The difference is enormous. Hamish looked at him for a long time. Then he nodded. But there was something new in his eyes. Not trust, not yet, but respect. The beginning of respect. The next day, a woman came to see Dan. A young woman, with dark hair tied back with a scarf. Her hands were calloused. Her face was calm. Her eyes were attentive. It was Leanna Mercer, Aldrich's daughter-in-law, the wife of his late son. She hadn't come to ask for anything. She'd come to make an offer. She said she had a mill, a broken one. The water wheel had fallen apart 3 years ago. The stream had run dry. The mill still stands. She hauls the grain 15 miles to a stranger's mill and pays a tithe for the grinding. If the Baron can find water, perhaps he can repair the mill as well. Dan went with her to the mill. The building was sturdy, stone walls, a shingle roof. The millstones were intact. But the wheel had fallen apart, and the trough through which the water flowed had cracked and dried up. Dan examined the stream, or rather what was left of it, a thin trickle that disappeared among the rocks 100 paces before the mill. He walked upstream along the bed. He found the spot where the water was seeping into a crack. He returned. He told Liana that there was water, but it was seeping underground. They needed to seal the crack and redirect the flow back into the stream bed, and they needed a new wheel. Liana asked how much it would cost. Dan said he wouldn't take any money, but once the mill was up and running, he'd ask her to grind grain for the miners for free. For the first 3 months. Then they'd work something out. Liana looked at him for a long time, silently, like someone trying to figure out if he was being deceived. Dan held her gaze. He knew that kind of look. The look of someone who had already been deceived, and more than once. Liana nodded. It took a week to build the wheel. Dan did the design, Finn forged the axle and the fasteners, Rowan made the gears. A carpenter named Grant sawed and assembled the blades. Dan built the transmission mechanism, a gear train made of wood and iron, simple yet effective, so that the wheel would smoothly and the millstones wouldn't jerk. Leanna came by every day. She'd stand and watch. Once she brought hot porridge for all the workers. Dan ate standing by the wheel, a bowl in one hand and a charcoal pencil in the other. Leanna said he'd forgotten to chew. Dan looked at the bowl. The porridge had gone cold. He laughed. For the first time in this world. They patched the crack in the channel with clay and stone. Water began to flow through the trough. The wheel gave a slight jolt. It turned. It creaked. And off it went. Smoothly. Rhythmically. The millstones hummed. Leanna stood by the mill door, holding a handful of flour. White, fresh. The flour trickled through her fingers. Leanna wasn't crying. She just stood there and breathed deeply, like someone who had been underwater for a long time and had finally surfaced. Dan walked over to her. He said that the gear ratio could be increased by adding a second set of gears. Then she wouldn't have to wake her son at 4 a.m. to feed the grain into the mill. The mechanism would handle it on its own. Leanna looked at him, and she placed her hand on his shoulder, gently, for a second. Then she took it away. She didn't say anything. She went inside. Dan stood by the door and watched her go. Then he rubbed his shoulder and walked back to the mine. At the end of the 4th week, a carriage arrived in Greyhold. Not a wagon, a carriage, with a coat of arms, but not accounts. It was a merchant's coat of arms, 3 crossed keys on a blue background. A young woman in a traveling dress stepped out of the carriage. She was short, black-haired, with a narrow face and quick eyes. She was holding a wooden box in her hand. Inside the box lay an abacus. It was Marin Ho, a representative of the Ryungan trading house. She had come on business. Marin demanded a meeting with the Baron. Hamish brought her to the mine because Dan was there. She saw him. In thermal underwear smeared with coal dust, with black hands, wearing a hard hat. She stopped. She looked at the mine, at the wheelbarrows full of coal, at the workers. Then she looked at Dan. She asked if he was the Baron. Dan said he was. Marin said she had come to buy the rights to mine Greyhold's mineral resources. She offered 200 gold pieces for full mining rights for 10 years. 200 gold pieces was a huge sum for Greyhold. Hamish, standing next to Dan, tensed up. Dan looked at Marin. Then he asked how much a metric ton of coal cost on the market in the capital. Marin answered without batting an eye. 15 gold pieces per metric ton of coal. Dan nodded. He said that, according to his rough estimates, there were between 20 and 50,000 metric tons under the eastern slope. Marin's expression didn't change, but her fingers on the abacus twitched. Dan said that 200 gold pieces for access to a resource worth hundreds of thousands was not an offer, but an insult. But he wasn't offended. He understood that this was business, and he proposed another option, a partnership, 50-50. She would handle logistics and sales. He would handle mining. Profits split evenly. Marin was silent for a minute. It was a long minute. Then she asked why he didn't just take the money and hire his own merchants. Dan replied that he didn't have any merchants, no caravans, no connections, no time to build all that up. But she has them, and she knows it. Otherwise, she wouldn't have come with 200 gold pieces to a man whose treasury held 14 silver pieces. Marin looked at him, then at the mine. Then she took a folded sheet of paper out of her pocket. She unfolded it. It was a draft contract. She'd come ready to negotiate. But she wasn't prepared for the offer of equality. Dan watched as she reread her last name in the contract next to his, as a partner, not as a buyer or a servant. She looked up. She said she needed time to think. Dan said she had time, but the coal wouldn't wait, and Count Valancourt wouldn't wait either. Marin stayed in Greyhold for 3 days. She walked through the mine. She did the math on her abacus. She talked to the workers. She checked the quality of the coal. On the third day, she came to Dan with a contract that had been revised. Minor but clever changes. The percentage from the first 3 shipments was slightly higher in her favor to cover the initial logistics costs. Then it would even out. Dan read it. He nodded. He signed it. Maren signed it. She looked at him. She said he was either a genius or a madman. Dan replied that in his line of work, they were one and the same. The first coal caravan left Greyhold 5 days after the contract was signed. 3 wagons, each loaded to the point where the axles creaked. Maren rode alongside the caravan. Dan stood at the gate and watched them head south down the road. Hamish stood beside him. He asked if Dan trusted this merchant. Dan replied that he trusted the numbers. Maren wasn't the type to cheat a partner. She's the kind who finds a way to earn more without breaking the contract. That's different. That's useful. While Maren was on the road, Dan got to work on his second project, a second well. This time, not by hand, but with a drilling rig. He chose a spot in the square in front of the castle where, according to his calculations, the aquifer was closest to the surface. The drilling rig was set up in 2 days. The workers already knew what to do: rope, drill bit, lift, strike. Again. And again. At a depth of 15 meters, they struck the aquifer. Water gushed out with such force that it knocked the bucket out of the well and flooded the square. People stood and watched as the water flowed over the rocks. The children ran into the puddle. Someone laughed. Someone cried. Dan stood there, soaked to the waist, cursing under his breath. Artesian pressure. We need a casing pipe to control the flow. He hadn't accounted for the pressure. A rookie mistake. Rowan stood nearby and cackled. She said the barren looked like a wet cat. Dan looked at her. Then he laughed too. They made the casing pipe in 3 days. It was made of copper, from scraps Finn had been saving for years. Dan showed her how to roll a sheet into a tube and solder the seam. Rowan did it on her first try. Her hands were precise. Dan told her so. He said her hand was more precise than his, that she could feel the metal. Rowan fell silent. She turned away. She went to the far corner of the smithy. Finn looked at Dan with an expression that Dan didn't immediately understand. Then he understood. Finn was grateful for the words he himself had never been able to say to his daughter. The second well was up and running. Dan installed the third one in the lower part of the village, where the poorest families lived, those who, until then, had still been walking 2 miles to the stream for water. By the end of the 5th week, there were 3 working wells in Greyhold. For the first time in 10 years, every family had access to clean water within walking distance. Dan didn't hold any ceremonies. He didn't give any speeches. He just got things done. The water flowed. People drank. That was enough. Around that time, Cecilia Ashworth arrived. She came in a wagon that looked as if it had been cobbled together from 3 different wagons. She had a single trunk with her, a heavy one. She couldn't lift it. The guard at the gate asked who she was. She identified herself as Baron Greyhold's lady-in-waiting. The guard looked at the wagon, at the trunk, at the young woman in a dress that had been expensive a year ago, but was now worn through at the elbows. He let her through. Cecilia found Dan at the mine. He was sitting at the entrance to the tunnel, drawing a map of the ventilation shafts. Cecilia stopped in front of him. She introduced herself. She explained that she was the youngest daughter of Viscount Ashworth, and that she had been sent to Greyhold by order of the Crown to serve as a lady-in-waiting, ensuring proper court etiquette in the barony. Dan looked up from his drawing. He looked at her, 22 years old, slender, pale, angry. Her eyes were red. She didn't want to be here. She'd been exiled. It was obvious. Dan asked if she knew how to write. Cecilia replied that she'd been educated at court and was fluent in 4 languages and skilled in calligraphy. Her voice rang with resentment. Dan nodded. He pulled his field journal from his breast pocket. It was crumpled, dirty, covered in small handwriting with numbers and diagrams. He handed it to her. He said he needed someone to keep records, well depths, production volumes, material consumption, and the coordinates of all drilling sites. He said her handwriting was better than his, and a mistake in a number meant the death of a man underground. Cecilia took the logbook and opened it. She looked at the entries. Then she looked at Dan. She asked if this was a joke. Dan said he wasn't joking. He needed a chronicler. She was educated. She was right there. He had no time for formalities, and he didn't need a lady-in-waiting. He needed a sharp mind. Cecilia snorted. She took the logbook. She left. She didn't sleep that night. She sat by candlelight in the room assigned to her and copied out Dan's entries in clean handwriting. His handwriting was terrible. His system of notation was chaotic. But there was logic behind the chaos. Depths were tied to specific points on the terrain. Rock types were recorded using abbreviations. Volumes were converted to local units of measurement. She worked through it like a puzzle, and by morning she had a neat table with data on all 3 wells and the adit, with coordinates, with depths, with rock types at each level. In the morning she brought the table to Dan. He looked at it. He read it over. He checked the numbers. He looked up. He said that in the 3rd well, she had corrected his mistake regarding the depth. He had written down 15 meters, but it was actually 14.5. Cecilia said she had double-checked using the length of the rope. Dan nodded. He said, "Good." Cecilia stood there waiting. She didn't even know what she was waiting for. Praise, perhaps? Or surprise. Dan said he needed a map of the entire barony with geological data plotted on it, and that she had 2 weeks to do it. Cecilia opened her mouth, closed it, turned around, and walked away. That evening, the first caricature appeared in the margins of the journal. It was of Dan wearing a hard hat with the caption, "Forgot to eat again, idiot." Marin returned 8 days later with empty wagons and a sack of gold coins. 37 gold pieces for 3 metric tons of coal, minus travel and security expenses. Net profit for Greyhold, 18 gold pieces. Dan took the sack, weighed it in his hand. 18 gold pieces, more than Greyhold had seen in the last 5 years. He looked at Hamish. Hamish was sitting at the desk in the office, staring at the coins. His hands were trembling. Not from weakness, from something else. Dan said the first thing they needed to do was buy grain, flour, salt, dried meat for the winter, then tools, iron, ropes, wood for supports, then clothes for the guards, boots, warm cloaks. Hamish nodded at every word. Then he looked up and said that the tax to the crown was 20 gold coins, payable in 4 months. Dan said they would pay, with coal if not with money. Hamish asked if they would accept coal. Dan said they would, because coal burns hotter than peat, and because the king's treasurer isn't a fool. That evening, Dan went out into the castle courtyard. It was dark. The sky was unfamiliar. The stars were unfamiliar. The wind was cold. He sat down on a rock by the wall and took out his tablet, 6% battery remaining. He opened the photo gallery. There was one photo there. Emily on the beach in Aberdeen, 7 years old, a red bucket in her hand, laughing. Dan stared at the screen until it went dark. Then he put the tablet in his pocket. He sat there for another minute. He stood up. He went inside. Work was waiting. Winter arrived in the 6th week. Not right away. First, the wind grew fiercer. Then, in the morning, frost appeared on the rocks. Then the first snow fell. Light, wet. It melted by noon, but Dan knew the next one wouldn't melt. He stood at the entrance to the tunnel and counted the days. 4 months until the tax was due. 3 weeks until the real frosts set in. 2 months until the food ran out if he didn't restock. There was no time. There was never any time. Marin left with the second caravan, 6 wagons, 10 metric tons of coal. Dan asked her to buy some iron on the way back. Not wrought iron, but raw iron. Cast iron scrap, broken cauldrons, broken plows, anything that could be remelted. Marin asked why. Dan said he was going to build a furnace. Marin asked what kind. Dan drew a sketch on a piece of paper. Marin looked at the drawing. She said it didn't look like any furnace she'd ever seen. Dan replied that was because no one in this world had built a furnace like that yet. While Marin was on her way, Dan began working on the heating project. He explained the idea to Hamish. A coal furnace in the center of the square. From it, pipes, clay ones, under the floors of the houses. Hot air flows through the pipes. The floors heat up. The houses get warm. Hamish listened. Then he said it was madness. Dan said that madness was the third winter in a row when children slept in fur coats and still got sick. Hamish fell silent. The pipes were made of clay. They kneaded it, they shaped it, they fired it in a bonfire. They turned out crooked, fragile. Dan cursed. He remade them. He showed them how to do it right. Rowan suggested coating the outside of the pipes with iron filings mixed with clay. Dan looked at her. He asked where she'd gotten that idea. Rowan shrugged. She said that when you coat a horn with this mixture, it retains heat longer, so the pipes would be stronger too. Dan nodded. They tried it. The pipes became 3 times stronger. He wrote this down in the log. Cecilia transferred the entry to her spreadsheet and noted in the margins that the idea belonged to Rowan Finch. Rowan saw her last name in the document. She stood there for a long time staring at it. Then she left. That evening, Finn quietly told Dan that Rowan had been smiling at dinner for the first time in a year. Pipes were laid under the floors of the 6 houses on the square. The central furnace was built of stone and coated with that very mixture Rowan had made. Dan lit the first fire himself. The coal caught fire. The heat traveled through the pipes. An hour later, the floor in the village headman's house grew warm. Hamish stood barefoot in the middle of the room, motionless. His wife sat by the wall, crying. Hamish turned to Dan. He took off his hat. He said he'd been against him. He said he'd been a fool. Dan replied that he wasn't a fool. He was the village headman. It was his job to be against something until he saw otherwise. Hamish put his hat back on. He nodded. And from that day on, he never once argued with Dan at the council meetings. That evening, all the residents of Greyhold gathered in the square. Children ran barefoot across the warm stone. The elderly sat without their fur coats. Some were silent. Some wept quietly. Dan stood by the castle wall and watched. Liana walked up to him. She stood beside him. She didn't say anything. She just stood there. Their shoulders were almost touching. Dan could feel the warmth of her body. In a foreign world, under foreign stars. It was the first warmth he had ever received rather than given. 3 days later, a girl arrived in Greyhold, on foot, with a baby in her arms. Or rather, not a baby, but a boy of about 4. Thin, silent. The girl was wearing torn clothes. Her feet were wrapped in rags. Her face was chapped and cracked. She made it to the gate and collapsed. The guards picked her up and carried her into the castle. Dan arrived just as Liana was already giving her some hot herbal tea. The girl's name was Jean Sol. She had come from the north, from the lands conquered by the Kairos Empire. Her village had burned down. Her parents had died. She'd been walking for 3 weeks, carrying her brother in her arms. She'd eaten bark and frozen grass. She'd headed south because she'd heard there was a place somewhere where they gave out water and coal for free. She didn't know the name. She just kept walking. Dan looked at her, at the boy hiding behind her back, not making a sound, at her hands covered in blisters and burns from the campfire. He turned to Liana and said, "Find her a room, and clothes, and food." Liana nodded. Cecilia, who was standing in the doorway, made a note in the logbook. First refugee, Ji In Sol, Northern Territories. Date of arrival, Jin spent a week recovering. She was silent. She ate. She slept. The boy, whose name was Theo, began to speak on the 3rd day. Before that, he had been silent. Liana said he'd simply forgotten how to speak. When Jin was back on her feet, she went to Dan and said she wanted to work. Not to ask, to work. Dan asked what she could do. Jiun said she could see. Dan didn't understand. Jiun explained. She couldn't sense the ether, not at all, ever since childhood. In her village, they considered her a cripple, but because of that, magic doesn't affect her. Illusions don't work on her. Mental spells don't penetrate her. She sees things as they really are, always. Dan was silent for a minute. Then he said she wasn't broken, that she was what magicians feared, that she was the kind of person he used to be before all this. Jean looked up. For the first time ever, she looked him in the face, and for the first time, she stopped averting her gaze. Dan said he needed someone who would walk with him and observe people, faces, those who come to Greyhold, because soon it won't just be refugees coming here. Jean nodded. Marin returned 12 days later, with money, with scrap iron, and with news. People in the capital were talking about Greyhold. The coal had caught their attention. 2 merchant houses had sent requests for supplies. The royal treasurer personally examined a sample and said he'd never seen coal like it. But there was other news as well. Count Valancourt filed a complaint with the royal court. He accused Dan of illegally mining mineral resources without a magical license. In Valenheim, any mining deeper than 2 meters required a permit from the Academy of Mages. Dan did not have such a permit. Dan listened. Then he asked how much the license cost. Marin said that for a barony of Greyhold's level, it was 50 gold pieces, plus an annual fee of 10 gold pieces, plus a mandatory inspection by an academy mage. Dan did the math. He had 26 gold pieces left after all his expenses. It wasn't enough, but he couldn't back down. He told Marin to prepare the license application, and to attach samples of coal and a mining report to it, the one Cecilia had written. It was neat and organized, with figures, with tables, with a map. The Academy had never seen a report like this before, because no one had ever documented production the way Dan did. The license application was sent with the 3rd caravan. Marin personally took it to the capital. Dan wrote a cover letter in which he laid everything out simply and concisely. The barony of Greyhold has discovered a coal seam. Mining is underway, ready to pay the license fee. Documentation enclosed. Cecilia rewrote the letter 3 times until her handwriting was perfect. In the margins of her personal diary, she drew a picture of Dan dictating the letter with coal dust on his face and signed it, "The Mole Baron." While Marin was away, Dan didn't sit to work. He began building a reverberatory furnace. Not right away. First, he needed a foundation, then refractory bricks, then a chimney, then the chamber itself. Dan drew blueprints every evening. Cecilia traced them onto white paper. Rowan looked at the blueprints and asked questions. Smart questions. Why is the chamber shaped that way? Why is the chimney curved instead of straight? Why is it slanted? Dan explained. Hot air reflects off the vault and is directed toward the metal. That's why it's a reverberatory furnace, a reflective one. The metal melts not from direct contact with the coal, but from the heat reflected by the vault. This produces a purer melt, less slag, better metal. Rowan listened. She nodded. Then she went to the anvil and forged parts for the furnace. Brackets, dampers, the grate. Finn worked nearby, but increasingly left the more complex parts to his daughter. His hands had grown slower. Age. He didn't complain, but Dan saw him rubbing his wrists after his shift. Once, Dan asked Finn how old he was. Finn said 53. Dan nodded. He said that in his world, blacksmiths retire at 60, and the best ones work until 70, but they take a day off every other day. Finn looked at him as if he were crazy. A day off every other day? Unheard of. Dan said that tired hands make bad metal, and bad metal kills people. Finn was silent for a moment, then he nodded. From that day on, he worked every other day, and on his days off, he sat by the forge and taught the young apprentices. There were already 3 of them, 2 guys from Greyhold and the girl from among the refugees who had arrived a week after Jine. It took a month to build the kiln. The bricks were molded from local clay mixed with quartz sand. They were fired in a pit using coal. Dan personally inspected every batch. He tapped each brick and listened to the sound. A dull sound meant it was poorly fired. A ringing sound meant it was good. Cecilia recorded the results: batch number, quantity, percentage of acceptable bricks, percentage of rejects, reason for rejection. When Marin returned and saw these records, she said that Dan had an accountant living in his head. Dan replied that he had an engineer living in his head, and that an engineer without records is like a blind surgeon. Marin brought news. The license application is under review. The Academy of Mages took an interest in the report. Not the coal, the report. They'd never seen documentation of this caliber. One of the masters asked for a copy. Marin made a copy, for 5 gold pieces. Dan looked at her. She shrugged. She said that information costs money. He knows that better than she does. Dan didn't argue, but he made a mental note. Marin was smarter than he'd thought, and more ambitious. The license was issued 3 weeks later, a 50 gold fee, 10 gold annually, an inspection by an academy mage every 6 months. Dan paid. 4 gold pieces remained in the treasury. Marin said the next caravan was leaving in 5 days and would bring another 30. Dan nodded. The balance was hanging by a thread. One disruption in supplies and everything would collapse. He didn't sleep that night. He sat in his office and did the math. Expenses, income, deadlines, volumes. Cecilia came in at 3 in the morning because she'd seen the light on. She brought a mug of hot herbal tea, set it on the table, didn't say a word, left. On the table next to the mug lay a fresh caricature. Dan with dark circles under his eyes and a caption, "The barony won't fall apart if you get 4 hours of sleep." The furnace was ready by the end of the 2nd month. Dan loaded the first batch of scrap iron, coal, fire. The heat rose slowly. Rowan stood by the damper and controlled the draft. Finn stood nearby. Dan stood by the viewing window and watched the melt. Temperature, the color of the metal. Cherry red means too low. Orange means just right. White means overheated. They kept it at orange for 4 hours. Then Dan gave the command. Rowan opened the tap. The molten metal flowed into the mold, bright, heavy, alive. It solidified slowly, darkened, hardened. An hour later, an ingot lay on the ground, rough, uneven, but it was steel. Not cast iron, not iron, steel. Dan picked up the ingot, heavy, warm. He tapped it with a hammer. The sound was clear, high-pitched, just right. Rowan took the ingot from his hands. She turned it over. She sniffed it. She bit it. She looked at Dan. There was something in her eyes that Dan didn't know the name for in the local language. In English, it had a simple name: pride. She was part of this. Her hands had made it, her furnace, her damper, her draft. Finn stood behind her, silently wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. He said some dust had gotten in. No one argued. Dan took the ingot and carried it to the study. He placed it on the table in front of Hamish. He said it was Greyhold's first steel. Hamish picked up the ingot. He turned it over in his hands. He asked how much it was worth. Dan said that 1 ingot of this quality was worth 2 gold pieces on the market, that 3 swords could be made from it, or 10 knives, or 1 set of armor, that Valenheim steel, brought from the southern mines, was of inferior quality and cheaper, that this steel from Greyhold was better. Hamish set the ingot back on the table. He looked at Dan, and for the first time, he didn't call him Baron. He called him by his first name. News of Greyhold steel spread quickly. Marin made sure of that. She sent samples to 3 merchant houses in the capital and 2 armory workshops at the royal court. 2 weeks later, the first order arrived. The royal guard wanted 50 blades, not swords, blades. Blanks that the palace smiths would finish themselves. The price? 3 gold pieces per blade, 150 gold pieces per batch. A sum that made Hamish's hands tremble when he read the letter. Dan wasn't thrilled. He did the math. 50 blades in 2 months. That's 10 smelting runs. Each smelting run means 4 hours of non-stop work at the forge, plus forging, plus tempering, plus polishing. He had one blacksmith and his daughter, 3 apprentices who were still learning, 1 forge. He looked at Rowan. Rowan looked at him. She said she could handle it. Dan said that handling it didn't mean surviving. He didn't need a dead blacksmith, he needed a living one. Rowan crossed her arms over her chest. She said she wasn't made of glass. Dan said he knew that, but the furnace runs every day. People don't. That's why they needed more people. He announced a recruitment drive. Who wants to learn how to work with metal? 7 people showed up, 4 men and 3 women. One of the women was Jine. Dan looked at her in surprise. Jine said she could do whatever she was shown and that she had strong hands. Dan didn't argue. Rowan took them on as apprentices. A week later, 2 dropped out. They couldn't handle the heat. 5 remained. Ji-in proved to be tenacious. Not the most talented, but the most tenacious. Rowan told Dan that Ji-in worked in silence and never complained, like a rock. Dan replied that rocks are the most reliable. The first 10 blades came out of the forge in the 3rd week. Dan inspected each one. Flexibility, hardness, edge. He rejected 2. Rowan argued. She said they were good. Dan said that good wasn't enough. The Royal Guard doesn't buy good, it buys the best. Rowan fell silent. She reforged both blades. The new ones were better. Dan accepted them. It was during this period that the first assassination attempt took place. Dan was in the forge. Evening, dark. Rowan had left. Finn had left. Dan stayed behind to check the temperature in the furnace before nightfall. He heard a sound, a quiet click, like the click of a crossbow bolt. He didn't think. His body reacted before his mind did. 10 years on the drilling rigs had taught him one rule. If you hear an unfamiliar sound, drop to the ground. He dropped. The bolt struck the wall behind him at chest level. He lay on the ground and heard footsteps on the roof, quick, receding, then silence. Finn was the first to arrive. Rowan was right behind him. The guards followed her. Dan was sitting on the floor of the smithy, staring at the bolt in the wall. A crossbow bolt, a good one, with a red-hot tip. Not locally made, imported, expensive. Finn pulled the bolt out of the wall. He looked at it. He turned pale. He said it was the Count's crossbow. He recognized the mark. Valancourt. Dan stood up. He brushed himself off. He looked at Finn. He said he needed protection. Finn said he would be his bodyguard. Dan said he needed a blacksmith, not a bodyguard. Finn said that in that case, let it be Rowan. Rowan, who was standing nearby with a hammer in her hand and her face white with rage, said she could take down any crossbowman with a single blow. Dan looked at her, at the hammer, at her face. He said thank you, but no. He needed someone who knew how to see, not how to strike. He turned toward the door. Jean was standing in the doorway, silently. She had arrived before anyone else, before Finn, before Rowan, before the guards. She had come because she'd seen a shadow on the roof as she was walking from the well, a shadow no one else had seen. Because the shadow was hidden by an illusion, and illusions had no effect on Jean. From that day on, Jin walked with Dan, not as a servant, as a shadow, quiet, attentive, with eyes that saw what was hidden. Dan gave her a knife. She said she knew how to use it. Dan didn't ask where she'd gotten it. Not every question needs to be asked. Hamish stepped up the guard. 20 of the 40 able-bodied men were now on duty in shifts. Dan understood that this wasn't a solution. 40 guards against the Count's mercenaries were nothing. He needed something else. He needed to become so valuable to the crown that it wouldn't be worth their while to touch him. And he knew how to do it. With steel, coal, and what lay deeper. The drill rig on the eastern slope was in operation every day. Dan was drilling deeper, 20 meters, 30. The rock types were changing. Shale gave way to sandstone. Sandstone turned into dense limestone. Dan recorded every layer. Cecilia plotted the data on a map, a vertical cross-section. The first geological cross-section in Erden's history, made not by magic, but by observation. At 35 meters, Dan found copper ore, green veins in the limestone, malachite, rich ore, easily mined. He picked up a sample and turned it over in his hand. In the dim light of the lantern, the green stone seemed alive. Dan put it in his pocket and climbed back up. On the surface, he sat down by the well and closed his eyes. Beneath Greyhold lay coal. There was copper. There was water. 3 things on which an economy could be built. 3 things that, according to all the mages, couldn't possibly be here. Because the mages were searching for ether, but he was looking for ore, and the ore spoke to him in a language he had been studying for 30 years. Copper changed everything. Coal was fuel, steel was a weapon, but copper was money. In Valenheim, copper coins were minted by the crown. The rights to the copper ore belonged to the king personally. This meant that Dan couldn't simply mine and sell it. He had to obtain a royal permit, and a royal permit meant that the king would learn about Greyhold not through rumors, but through an official request. Dan sat and thought about it all day. Then he called for Maren. Maren arrived from the capital 4 days later. She already knew. She had her own sources. She sat down across from Dan in his office and placed an abacus on the table. She said the situation was complicated. Copper ore was a royal monopoly. Mining it without permission wasn't just a fine, it meant the confiscation of his barony and imprisonment. Dan nodded. He asked what would happen if they didn't mine it, but instead discovered it and reported it. He suggested offering the king an exclusive contract to supply the ore at a fixed price, with guaranteed volumes. Maren clicked the beads of her abacus. She thought for a moment. She said it might work if the offer was lucrative enough for the crown, and if they beat the count to it. Count Valancourt was already taking action. Maren said rumors were circulating in the capital. The count had submitted a petition to annex Greyhold to his domains, on the grounds that Greyhold could not ensure its own security. The assassination attempt on the Baron was proof of that. Dan snorted. His own mercenary had fired the shot, yet he was using the assassination attempt as an argument. Maren said that in politics that was normal. Dan said that in engineering it was called sabotage. Maren shrugged. They drafted a proposal for the king. Dan dictated, Cecilia wrote. Maren edited the wording. The barony of Greyhold has discovered copper ore deposits at a depth of 35 meters. The barony is prepared to supply the ore to the crown at a fixed price 20% below market value, in exchange for royal protection and the right to independent mining. The contract is for 5 years with the option to extend. Maren added a clause stating that all taxes on copper production would go directly to the royal treasury, bypassing the provincial level. This meant that Count Valancourt would not receive a single coin. Dan looked at that clause. He looked at Maren. She smiled, a narrow, sharp smile. The proposal was sent with the caravan. Maren went in person. Dan stayed behind. He had work to do. It wasn't enough just to find the copper ore. He had to prove that it existed in sufficient quantities. He expanded the drilling operations, a second borehole, a third. Each one confirmed it. The copper seam stretched beneath the entire eastern slope. Its thickness ranged from 0.5 meter to 2 meters. The ore was rich. The copper content, by his estimate, ranged from 5 to 8%. In a world where ore with a 1 to 2% content was mined, this was a fortune. Cecilia drew a map of the deposit, the first map in Erdan's history to feature ore content isolines. She didn't know that they were called isolines. Dan explained. Lines connecting points with the same concentration, like contour lines on a topographic map, only underground. Cecilia listened. She drew. She asked for clarification. 3 days later, the map was ready. Beautiful, accurate, with symbols and a legend. Dan looked at her and, for the first time in a long while, felt something akin to peace. Not because the map was good, but because there were people beside him who were learning, who were growing, who were getting better every day. The king's reply arrived 3 weeks later, not by letter, by messenger. A royal messenger in a blue uniform on a white horse. He brought a scroll bearing the king's seal. The king had accepted the proposal. A 5-year contract, copper ore, a fixed price, royal protection. And one more clause that Dan hadn't asked for, the right to form a baronial militia of up to 100 men. Dan read that clause twice. Then he looked at Hamish. Hamish read it and turned pale. A militia. 100 men. It meant the king considered Greyhold important enough to defend, and dangerous enough to keep under control. That evening, Dan sat on the castle wall and looked out at Greyhold. Lights were burning below, smoke from the furnaces, the clang of hammers from the smithy. Rowan was working the night shift. Finn sat next to her, sharpening the blanks. Liana was carrying a bucket from the well. Cecilia was leaning over a map at the study window. Jean stood 3 paces behind Dan, as always. Silence. 3 months. 90 days. He had arrived in the dead barony with a hard hat and a clipboard. Now the barony had water, coal, steel, copper, a contract with the crown, the right to raise a militia, and an enemy who had no intention of retreating. Dan knew that Count Valancourt wouldn't stop. Losing Greyhold from under his control was a loss of face, and for an aristocrat, a loss of face is worse than a loss of money. There would be more mercenaries, there would be more crossbowmen, there would be something worse. But right now, this evening, Dan just sat there and watched the lights, and he thought about how, somewhere beneath those lights, 70 meters deep, lay something he hadn't found yet. Something that would make him regret every well he'd drilled, or thank him for them. He didn't know yet, but the drill was running, and tomorrow he'd lower the bit another meter. The well had reached 40 meters by the 4th month. Dan stood by the shaft and looked down. Darkness, deep, real, the kind a flashlight couldn't reach. He knew this darkness. It was on every drilling rig, on every platform, on every derrick. Darkness underground. His darkness. The drill bit sank into sandstone, then into basalt, dense, heavy. The basalt dulled the bit in half a day. Rowan rehardened it every evening. Her hands were burned by the red-hot metal. Dan told her to make double-layered leather gloves. She did. The burns became less frequent. At the 42nd meter, the basalt became strange. Dan noticed this from the drilled-out cuttings. The rock was not homogeneous. It had inclusions. Not mineral, not crystalline, something else. He brought the cuttings to the surface. He rinsed them. He examined them through the magnifying glass that Marin had brought him from the capital for 4 gold pieces. The inclusions were gray, uniform, with a smooth surface. It didn't resemble any rock he knew. He made a note in the log. Depth 42 meters, anomalous inclusions in the basalt matrix. Mature unknown. Drilling must continue. Cecilia transcribed the entry. She asked what it meant. Dan said he didn't know yet. Cecilia transcribed his words exactly. Doesn't know yet. And in the margins, she drew a question mark, the first and only punctuation mark in her logbook. Meanwhile, Marin was expanding her trade. The 4th caravan, the 5th, the 6th. Coal was being sent to the capital. Steel was going to the Royal Guard. They began extracting copper ore from the 2nd tunnel. Money was flowing into Greyhold's treasury, not like a river, but like a stream. A steady stream, though. Dan issued orders regarding expenditures, 1/3 for supplies, 1/3 for development, and 1/3 for reserves. Hamish approved. Marin approved with an amendment. 25 for supplies, 35 for development, 40 for the reserve. Because winter wasn't over yet, and because the Count hadn't made his next move yet. The Count made his move sooner than they expected. Not a military one, a trade move. He blocked the southern route, the only road from Greyhold south to the capital. Formally, it was repair work. The bridge over the River Cane was damaged. The road was closed indefinitely. The bridge belonged to the Count. The road ran through his lands. Everything was legal, and everyone understood that it was a blockade. Marin rode all the way from the capital in 2 days. She was furious, soaked from the rain. She said the caravan was stuck at the bridge. They wouldn't let them through. The Count's guards, polite, they were smiling. They said the bridge was dangerous. Marin inspected the bridge. The bridge was fine. 2 new planks had been nailed on for show. It was a blockade, plain and simple. Dan called a meeting. Hamish, Marin, Cecilia, Finn, Rowan. Jean stood by the door. Dan laid out the situation. The southern route is closed. It's the only route for heavy caravans. There's an eastern trail, but it's passable only for pack horses and only in the summer. There's a northern route, but it leads to the border of the Kairos Empire. The Count is waiting for Greyhold to suffocate without trade and come crawling back. Marin said they could file a complaint with the royal court. Dan asked how long it would take to be heard. Marin said 3 to 6 months. Dan said that in 3 months they'd be bankrupt. They needed another solution. Hamish suggested forcing the bridge open. Dan said that would mean war. They weren't ready for war. Rowan suggested dismantling the bridge and building their own one nearby. Dan looked at her, then at the map. The Cane River, wide but not deep. Shallow near the west bank, a ford. He asked Hamish if there was a ford across the Cane River west of the bridge. Hamish thought for a moment. He said the old folks had told stories of a ford 3 miles upstream, but the path there was overgrown and the bank is marshy. Dan said that a marshy bank was a solvable problem. He took a pencil and drew a sketch. Drainage ditches, a log plank road, a gravel embankment leading up to the ford. 2 days' work for 20 people. Marin looked at the sketch. She said that was a detour, not a bridge, a temporary one. Dan said that in engineering, temporary solutions often become permanent. Work began the next day. 20 men, 10 women, axes, shovels, wheelbarrows. Dan supervised in person. He stood knee-deep in the swamp and showed them where to place the logs. Hamish stood nearby and grumbled that a barren shouldn't be standing in the mud. Dan replied that an engineer should be where the work is. Hamish fell silent and picked up a shovel. 3 days later, the detour was ready. Rough, made of logs and stone, but passable. The wagons moved slowly. They creaked. They got stuck. But they moved forward. The first caravan crossed the ford on the 4th day. Marin rode at the front. When the wagons reached the southern road, already past the bridge, she turned and looked toward the Count's estate. And she smiled. That same narrow, sharp smile. Count Valancourt learned of the detour 2 days later. His spies had reported it. He stood in his study, staring at the map. Greyhold, a tiny dot, an insignificant barony, rocks and dust. 3 months ago, there was nothing there. Now there was water, coal, steel, copper, a contract with the king, and a baron who bypasses bridges just as water flows around rocks. The Count poured himself some wine. He drank it. He set the goblet down. He called for his aide-de-camp. He said 2 words. Call Eloise. In Greyhold, Dan stood by the borehole, 46 meters deep. The basalt continued. Strange inclusions were becoming more frequent. At 45 meters, he pulled up a sample in which the gray, smooth substance was no longer just inclusions, but a layer, a thin one, about a finger's width thick. Smooth. Too smooth to be a natural formation. Dan sat by the borehole, holding the sample. He turned it between his fingers, he looked at it, and his hand trembled. Not from the cold, from realization. He knew what it was. He'd seen it thousands of times, on construction sites, on roads, in foundations. It was concrete. Concrete. Dan sat in his office and looked at the sample, gray, smooth, with tiny inclusions that looked like ceramic grit. Not a natural formation, man-made. at a depth of 45 meters beneath a layer of basalt. Someone had been building here, a long time ago, a very long time ago. Before magic, before the ether, before everything this world considered the beginning. He didn't tell anyone. Not yet. He jotted it down in a separate notebook he kept with him. Depth, 45 meters. Artificial material. The composition is similar to concrete. The reinforcing component is presumably ceramic. The thickness of the layer increases with depth. Conclusion. There is a structure beneath Greyhold. Age unknown, purpose unknown. He closed the notebook, put it in his pocket, and walked over to the drill rig. Drilling continued. 47 meters, 49. At 50 meters, the concrete layer became a wall. The drill bit stopped advancing. The concrete was harder than basalt. Dan switched to a heavier drill bit. Rowan had forged it in 2 days, a special one, with a cobalt-tipped edge. There was no cobalt here, but Dan found a substitute, an alloy of iron and quartz, hardened using a special method. Not perfect, but good enough. The new chisel cut through the concrete at the 52nd meter. Beyond the wall was a void. The chisel sank half a meter and hung from the rope. Dan lowered a lantern on a rope into the hole. The light went down and didn't return as a reflection. There was space down there, a lot of it. He sealed the borehole. He put a cover on it. He posted 2 guards. He said it was for safety. The guards didn't ask any questions. Dan returned to the castle and called for Hamish. He told him what had happened, not everything, just that there was a cavity deep underground, maybe a cave, maybe something else. They needed to go down and take a look. Hamish asked why. Dan said there might be something valuable underground. Hamish nodded. He understood what valuable meant. They began driving a tunnel horizontally toward the cavity from the eastern slope at a depth of 50 meters. It was easier than descending vertically through a narrow shaft. 10 workers, wooden supports, a ventilation shaft. The work progressed slowly, basalt, then concrete. The concrete was tough to break through, 3 meters a day at most. Dan kept track. It was about 30 meters horizontally to the cavity, 10 days' work. He was wrong. 15. And the 15th day, a worker's pickaxe broke through the wall and plunged into the void. The worker recoiled. A gust of air blew through the opening. Cold, dry, odorless. Dan stepped forward. He widened the opening with his hands. He shone his flashlight inside and froze. Beyond the wall was a corridor, straight, with smooth walls, with a floor made of the same concrete, with a ceiling 3 meters high. The corridor stretched off in both directions and vanished into the darkness. There were marks on the walls, not letters, not runes, symbols, geometric, precise, impressed into the concrete. Dan recognized some of them. Arrows, directional markers, numbers. Not local, not Valenheimian. Different, but legible, understandable, universal. He stood in the opening and breathed. His hands were shaking. Not from fear, from the sheer scale of it. This isn't a cave. It's a structure. Someone built this. Beneath the basalt, beneath the coal, beneath the copper ore, beneath everything this world considered its foundation. And then it was buried. Or it buried itself, or someone buried it on purpose. Dan returned to the surface. He sealed off the entrance to the tunnel. He posted guards. And for the first time since he'd been in Greyhold, he gathered not a council, but his own team. Liana, Cecilia, Marin, Rowan, Jean. 5 women in the castle's office. The door was closed. He told them everything. About the concrete, about the corridor, about the symbols, about what it all meant. There had been a civilization in this world before magic, a technological one that built with concrete, one that wrote with symbols, and it had vanished, or been destroyed, or hidden. Liana listened in silence, her hands folded in her lap. Her face was calm. Cecilia listened with eyes ablaze, pen already in hand, ready to take notes. Marin listened and calculated. Dan could see her fingers moving on the abacus under the table. She was already assessing what it was worth, who to sell it to, how to use it. Rowan sat there frowning. She didn't understand why she needed to know this. She was a blacksmith. Metal was her business. Jean stood by the door, looking at Dan. Just looking. Dan said it was a secret, for now, because the Church of the First Light teaches that there was nothing before magic. But he had found proof that there was, and if the Church found out, it wouldn't send a letter, it would send an inquisitor. Marin said the inquisitor was already on his way. Everyone turned to her. Marin explained. Her sources in the capital had reported that Count Valancourt had appealed to the Church. He accused Dan of heresy, of obtaining forbidden artifacts, and of desecrating the land. The Church appointed an inquisitor. Her name, Eloise Vane. Eloise Vane arrived a week later, on horseback, alone, without an entourage, without guards, wearing a black cloak with a silver clasp shaped like a sun, the symbol of the Church of the First Light. She dismounted at the gate. The guards parted, not because they feared the woman, but because they feared the clasp. Dan met her in the castle courtyard. She was tall, fair-haired, with a face that would have been beautiful were it not for her expression, the expression of someone who had come not to converse, but to judge. She introduced herself, an inquisitor of the Order of the First Light, authorized to investigate charges of heresy, to inspect the estate, to interrogate the barren, to reach a conclusion. Her voice was even, cold, professional. Dan bowed, at the same 30-degree angle as in the throne room 4 months ago. He said that Greyhold was open for inspection, that he would grant full access to the mines, to the forge, to the furnace, to the records. Eloise looked at him. She had expected something else: fear, evasiveness, attempts at bribery. Dan stood calmly, like a man who had nothing to hide. Eloise narrowed her eyes. She knew that when a person has nothing to hide, they're usually not that calm. It's those who hide things very well who remain calm. The inspection lasted 3 days. Eloise examined the mine. She descended into the mine. She touched the walls. She examined the support structures. Dan walked beside her and explained. The coal seam, a depth of 9 meters. The mining method, ventilation, support. Eloise listened. She asked questions, not stupid ones. Where did he learn about drilling? Who taught her to build a furnace? Why is steel better than Vallenheim steel? Dan answered honestly. He's an engineer from another world. His knowledge isn't magic, it's science, calculations, experience. Eloise took notes. She didn't say a word. On the second day, she demanded access to the drilling site on the eastern slope. Dan showed her. A 40-meter deep borehole, copper ore, Cecilia's geological cross-section. Eloise stared at the map for a long time. She asked what isolines were. Cecilia explained. Eloise nodded. She looked at Cecilia. She said that for a lady-in-waiting, she was too smart. Cecilia blushed and replied that for an inquisitor, she was too curious. Eloise smiled slightly, just a little, for half a second. On the third day, she asked about the sealed adit, that very one, the one with guards at the entrance. Dan knew this moment would come. He could have lied, said the tunnel was dangerous, a cave-in, gas, anything. He didn't. He looked at Eloise and said that behind that door lay the very thing for which the Count had set the Church on him. Not heresy, the truth. And that he would show it to her if she promised one thing, to look before she judged. Eloise was silent for a long time. Then she said that she was an inquisitor and didn't make promises to suspects. Dan nodded. He said that in that case, he'd show her without any promises, because the truth needs no conditions. Eloise looked at him. Something in her face flinched. Not the icy mask, something beneath it. She said, "Show me." Dan took the lantern. He opened the tunnel. He led her inside, 50 meters deep, through basalt, through a breached wall, into a corridor. Eloise walked in silence. When they entered the corridor, she stopped. She looked at the walls, at the symbols, at the smooth concrete, at the ceiling. She reached out and touched the wall, ran her fingers over the symbol, and pulled her hand away as if she'd been burned. Dan asked what had happened. Eloise said quietly that this symbol, she recognized it. It was a liturgical symbol. The Church of the First Light uses it in worship. It means light. But here, on a wall underground, in a place older than the church, older than magic, older than the ether. She stood there, staring at the wall. A minute, 2, 5. Then she turned to Dan. She said that if he told even one joke right now, she'd slit his throat. Dan didn't tell any jokes. He took a flask of hot tea out of his pocket, the tea Liana had brewed that morning. He poured some into the lid and handed it to Eloise. She took it. Her hands were shaking. She drank it, in silence. Then she sat down right on the floor of the corridor and sat there for a long time. When they emerged above ground, it was dark. Stars, wind. Eloise stopped at the entrance to the tunnel. She looked up at the sky, then at Dan. She said her report would be ready in 2 days. She went into the room assigned to her. Dan stood there, watching her go. Jean approached quietly. She said that Eloise wasn't lying. Dan asked how she knew. Jean said that liars have different eyes. Eloise had the eyes of someone in pain. Pain isn't hidden. Lies are. Eloise didn't leave her room for a full day. Liana brought her food. The plates were returned untouched. On the second morning she came out, pale, with dark circles under her eyes, a scroll in her hand. She found Dan by the smithy. She held out the scroll. Dan unrolled it. He read it. Conclusion of the Inquisitor of the Order of the First Light, Barony of Greyhold. Charges of heresy are not substantiated. Mining operations are being conducted legally. A license is in effect. No magical violations detected. Recommendation: drop the charges. Signature: seal. Dan looked at Eloise. She stood upright. Her face was stony, but her eyes were different. Not the same as a week ago. A week ago there had been ice in them. Now there was something alive in them. Bitter, but alive. Dan rolled up the scroll. He said thank you. Eloise said there was no need to thank her. She'd done her job. Dan nodded. He asked what she would do next. Eloise said she would return to the capital. She would submit her report, and she would wait. Dan asked what for. Eloise replied that once the church read her report, it would either accept it or revoke her authority and send someone more compliant. Dan was silent for a moment. Then he said there was always a room for her at Greyhold, if she needed it. Eloise looked at him. She said nothing. She mounted her horse. She rode off. Count Valancourt received a copy of the report 4 days later, and he flew into a rage. Dan learned this from Marin. Her spies at the Count's estate reported that the Count had smashed a mirror in his study and yelled at his aide for half an hour. Then he calmed down. He sat down, he drank some wine, and he began to plan. This time, not a trade blockade, not a legal complaint. This time, a military operation. Dan knew this was coming. He didn't know when. He began to prepare. The militia, 100 men by royal decree. Hamish recruited 70. The remaining 30 were refugees from the north. Jean found former soldiers among them, 5 of them. Dan appointed them as squad leaders. Rowan forged weapons, swords, spears, arrowheads, Greyhold steel. Better than the Earls. But Dan wasn't preparing weapons. He was setting a trap, not for people, for the situation. He spent a week studying the terrain around Greyhold, with Hamish, with Jin, with Cecilia and her maps. He wasn't looking for defensive positions. He was looking for water, streams, springs, aquifers, anything that flowed, anything that could be channeled, redirected, to stop or to let flow. The plan was simple. Greyhold stood on a plateau. Below the plateau, on the southern slope, lay the floodplain of the Cane River, the only place where a siege camp could be set up. Flat, with water, with pastures for horses. Any army would set up camp right there. And that was exactly where Dan decided to cause a flood. He found the spot, upstream, a narrow section of the riverbed where the banks converged. There he could build a dam, a simple one made of earth, with a wooden frame and a locking mechanism. Let the water build up for 3 days, then open it, and all the accumulated water would rush down the floodplain. It wouldn't kill anyone, but it would flood everything: tents, provisions, supply trains. The siege camp would become a swamp. Rowan said it was underhanded. Dan said it was engineering. Hamish said it was genius. Merrin said it was risky if the Count found out beforehand. Dan nodded. That's why they built the dam at night. 20 men, 10 nights, in silence, without a fire. Jean stood guard every night. Her eyes saw better in the dark than any sentries. Night vision magic didn't work on her, but she didn't need it. She simply saw, like a cat. The dam was ready. The water began to rise behind the wall of logs and clay. Slowly. Dan measured the volume every day. Cecilia recorded the level. Everything was ready. All that was left was to wait. They didn't have to wait long. On the 3rd day after the dam was completed, Hamish's scouts spotted dust on the southern road. Cavalry, followed by infantry. Behind the infantry, supply wagons. Count Valancourt's banners, 200 men against 100. Hamish turned pale. Dan didn't. He stood on the castle wall and looked toward the floodplain. Down there they were already pitching tents, building fires, watering the horses from the river. Everything was going according to plan. Dan waited 2 days. He let them settle in. He let them get used to it. He let them decide that the siege would be long and comfortable. On the 3rd night, he sent 5 men to the dam, quietly, in the dark. Jean led them. They made it there. They opened the floodgate and left. The water came at dawn, not as a wall, not as a wave. The river simply became wider all of a sudden, and higher and faster. The tents got soaked. Then they floated away. The wagons got stuck. The horses panicked. People woke up knee-deep in water. Panic. Screams. A stampede toward the high bank. Not a single casualty. But the camp was destroyed. The provisions were flooded. The gunpowder for the siege engines was soaked. The siege ended before it even began. Dan stood on the wall and watched. Hamish stood beside him, and Rowan, and Liana, and Cecilia, who was writing everything down, and Merrin, who was tallying the Count's losses on her abacus, and Jean, who had returned, wet and silent. Dan turned to them. He said this was only the first round. The Count would retreat, but he'd return, and next time he'd be smarter. They needed to be one step ahead of him, always. After the flood, a lull set in. The Count retreated. His soldiers left, wet and angry. But the lull was deceptive, and Dan knew it. The Count had lost face twice. The blockade had been bypassed. The siege had been broken. For an aristocrat, this was worse than defeat in battle. A battle could be chalked up to fate. Humiliation could not. Dan didn't wait for the Count's third move. He made his own move. He sent Marin to the capital with a full report on Valancourt's actions, the blockade of the bridge, the mercenary crossbowmen bearing the Count's mark, the false accusation of heresy, and the military attack on a barony under royal protection. Every fact was backed up by Cecilia's documentation, dates, witness testimony, the marked bolt that Finn had kept. Marin said that was enough for the Count to lose his title. Dan said he didn't need the Count to die. He needed to keep him on a leash. The royal court heard the case in 2 weeks, a record time. Copper ore and steel blades made Greyhold too valuable to ignore. Count Valancourt was issued a warning and fined 500 gold pieces, a ban on military action against the barony of Greyhold, and a humiliating stipulation. The Count was required to rebuild the bridge over the Cane River and ensure free passage for 1 year. Marin delivered the news with the smile Dan had grown accustomed to, narrow, sharp, triumphant. But Dan didn't celebrate. He would go down into the corridor every day with a lantern and a notebook, alone. No, not alone, with Gina. She followed him in silence. Her eyes saw things in the darkness that his couldn't. Once she stopped him by the arm. She pointed to the wall. Dan shone his light there. There was a panel, recessed into the wall, smooth, with a recess in the middle. The indentation was shaped like a palm. Dan held out his hand. He didn't touch it, he just held it out. The size matched. He shifted his gaze to a detail, a small one, almost imperceptible. In the center of the indentation was a mark, a thin line, right where the drill bit had left a scar on his thumb. A coincidence, an impossible coincidence. Dan stood and stared. Jean stood beside him, waiting. He placed his palm on the panel. It fit perfectly. The scar lined up with the mark. Something clicked deep inside the wall, quietly, and a section of the wall shifted. It didn't open. It shifted by 2 fingers' width. That was enough to realize it. There was a door here. Dan didn't open it. Not now, not alone. He memorized the spot, jotted it down in his notebook, and went back upstairs. He needed to prepare, and he needed his people. All of them. He spent a week preparing. Flashlights, ropes, 2 days' worth of food, tools, paper for notes, ink for Cecilia. He selected those who would go with him. Not Hamish. Hamish was needed upstairs. Not Finn. Finn was needed in the smithy. Those who had been with him from the start would go. Liana, Cecilia, Marin, Rowan, Jean. 5 women who had become his team, his family, not by blood, by choice, by work, by what they had built together from the stones. Eloise returned the day before the descent, without warning, on horseback, alone, wearing the same black cloak, but without the silver clasp. The church's symbol was gone. She dismounted at the gate. She found Dan. She said the church had revoked her authority, that her verdict had been rejected, that a new inquisitor had been appointed, and that he would not be alone. He would be accompanied by a detachment of the temple guard, 20 men. They would arrive in 10 days. Dan asked why she had come. Eloise said she had come to warn him, and to stay, if he would let her. Dan looked at her, at the woman who had betrayed her order for the sake of the truth she had seen on the wall of the underground corridor. He said a room was ready for her. Eloise nodded. Dan said that tomorrow they'd go down, all of them, and that she was coming with them. In the morning, they stood at the entrance to the tunnel, 7 of them. Dan, Liana, Cecilia, Marin, Rowan, Jean, Eloise. The lanterns were lit. The ropes were ready. Dan looked at each of them. Liana was calm. Cecilia had a pen behind her ear and a notebook in her hand. Marin had an abacus in her pocket. Rowan had a hammer slung over his shoulder just in case. Jean had a knife on his belt. Eloise stood with her back straight and her hands empty. Dan said one word. "Let's go." And they stepped into the darkness. A tunnel, basalt, a breach in the wall, a corridor, footsteps on concrete, an echo, silence. The flashlights swayed and shadows danced across the walls. Signs on the walls floated past. Eloise walked along, touching each one. Her fingers trembled. Cecilia sketched the ones she could catch. Marin counted their steps. Liana walked beside Dan, holding the second flashlight. Rowan brought up the rear, looking back over her shoulder. They reached the control panel. Dan raised his hand. He placed his palm on it. A click. The wall slid aside. Further, deeper than last time. Dan pushed. The wall slid inward. Beyond it was a hall, large, lit by a soft white light. No torches, no fire. The light came from everywhere and nowhere. In the center of the hall stood a table, stone, or perhaps not stone, made of a material Dan didn't know the name of. A map lay on the table, The map was enormous. It covered the entire table and hung over the edges. But it wasn't paper. The surface was smooth and hard, like glass or like a tablet screen. Dan walked over. He leaned in and saw the world. Not Valenheim, not just one kingdom, the whole world. Continents, seas, mountain ranges, rivers, and cities. Dozens of cities, hundreds, tiny dots with names, in a language that didn't exist in modern Airden. But Dan could read it, because the symbols were the same as those on the corridor walls, and because some of them resembled the liturgical symbols of the church, and because he recognized one word on the map immediately: Greyhold. Only it was spelled differently, and next to it was a symbol that no other city had: a key. Eloise was on her knees, not out of weakness. Her legs had simply buckled. She was looking at the map, and her lips were moving. She was reading the liturgical symbols, which here were not a prayer. They were navigation, signposts, coordinates. The language of prayer she had learned since childhood turned out to be the language of engineers, those who built this hall, this corridor, these walls. Long before the church, long before the ether, long before everything. Cecilia was already drawing, feverishly, the pen scratched across the paper. She was copying the map. Not all of it, as much as she could. Every symbol, every line, every name. Marin stood at the edge of the table and counted the cities. Her lips moved silently. 112, 113. On the map of the world, where there were now fewer than 20 major cities, there were over 100 here. Civilization, not tribes, not villages. Civilization with cities and roads and bridges, and something that looked like railroads, only without tracks. Rowan stood by the wall and touched it. The wall was warm, like the floors in the houses on Greyhold Square. Heating, underground. It had been working for thousands of years. She turned to Dan. She asked how. Dan shook his head. He said he didn't know. Not yet, anyway. Liana stood next to him, silent, as always. Then she said quietly that there was something on the wall behind the table. Dan turned around. Above the table, on the wall, was an image, not a drawing, a relief, carved into the wall's material. It depicted a diagram. Dan stepped closer. The diagram looked familiar, a geological cross-section, layers of rock, and beneath them, deep down, lines. A network of lines radiating from a single point. The point was marked with the same symbol as the one next to Greyhold on the map. A key. The lines extended in all directions, to every city on the map. A network, an underground network, connecting the entire world. And at the center of this network, on the relief, was another symbol. Dan didn't recognize it, but Eloise did. She rose from her knees. She walked over. She looked, and she said one word: source. In the liturgical language, this symbol meant source, the first light, what the church called a divine gift, that from which, according to doctrine, the ether came. It was not in the heavens. It was underground. And it was not a gift. It was a machine. Dan stood there looking at the diagram. A machine, underground, the creator of the ether, of magic, of everything this world was built upon. Magic was not a gift from the gods. Magic was a leak, a byproduct, something that had spiraled out of control when the machine broke down, or when it was destroyed, or when it did what it was created to do. And then someone buried it all, covered it up, poured basalt over it, erased the memory, built a church that declared the past a sin and forbade digging. And then a driller came from another world, with a hard hat, with a tablet, with 30 years of experience, and he began to dig. Dan turned to face them, all of them. Liana stood to his right. Her face was calm, her hands were folded. She didn't understand everything she saw, but she understood the main thing. Dan had found something important, just like he'd found water for Aldrich, just like he'd found coal, just like he'd found copper, only bigger. Cecilia stood on the left with a notebook pressed to her chest. Her eyes were ablaze. She already knew that this notebook was worth more than all the gold in Vallenheim. Maren stood by the table, her fingers running along the edge of the map. She was counting, not money. For the first time in her life, not money. She was calculating the scale. Rowan stood by the wall, silent, a hammer on her shoulder. Her face was serious. She wasn't a scholar. She wasn't a merchant. She wasn't a cartographer. She was a blacksmith. And she understood one thing. Whoever built this knew more about metal than all the blacksmiths of Erden put together. And she wanted to learn. Jaina stood by the door. Her eyes were calm. She was the only one not awed by this hall, because she had always known. The world isn't what it's made out to be. She'd seen it since childhood, and now the others had seen it too. Eloise stood before the relief on the wall. Her back was straight. Her hands were clenched into fists. For 30 years, she had served the church, which had built its power on lies, on a hidden truth, on a buried past. And now that truth was staring at her from the wall of the underground hall. Dan stood in the center, in thermal underwear, with a lantern in his hand, with coal dust under his fingernails. No magic, no ethereal spark, no sword. An engineer, a driller, a man who knows how to extract from beneath the earth what everyone considers non-existent. He looked at the map, at the network of lines, at the point marked with a key symbol. Greyhold stood at the junction of this network. Not by chance. He wasn't placed here by accident, and he hadn't been transported here by accident either. The panel bore the imprint of his palm, with the scar from the crown. Someone had been waiting for him, or for someone like him. Or perhaps he himself, from another cycle, had left a mark for his own reference. He didn't know, and that was fine. He never knew everything. He knew enough to start drilling, and then the rock told the rest of the story. He turned to face them, the 6 women standing around him in the chamber, 50 meters below the rock's surface. Each of them had come to him for her own reason. Each of them had found something here that she hadn't had before. Liana found a home. Cecilia found meaning. Maren found equality. Rowan found herself. Jean found a place where she didn't have to hide. Eloise found the truth. And Dan found a family. Not the one left behind on the M6 in a world that no longer existed for him. A new one. From work. From stone. Made of coal and steel and water and concrete. He smiled, quietly, with just one corner of his mouth. The way engineers smile when a project turns out to be more complicated than they thought, but they know they'll manage, because they have a team, and tools, and time, and perseverance, and rock that's waiting. He said quietly, "All right, now the real work begins." Then he turned toward the exit, because upstairs a world awaited them, one that did not yet know it stood on the ruins of the past. A world in which, in 10 days, the temple guard would arrive. A world in which the Count is hatching a new plan. A world in which the king awaits copper, the church awaits submission, and the people of Greyhold await warmth, bread, and safety. A world that must not be conquered, but rebuilt from the ground up. As always, like any project, one layer at a time, 1 meter at a time. Dan walked down the corridor toward the light. 6 others followed him. Their footsteps sounded even and firm on the concrete. The echoes faded into the darkness behind them. There on the table lay a map of a world that no longer exists, and from which a better world could emerge. They emerged onto the surface, the sun, the wind, Greyhold below, smoke from the chimneys, the clang of hammers, children in the square, the warm ground beneath his bare feet, Aldrich by the well, Finn at the smithy, Hamish at the gate. The life he'd built from nothing, from a hard hat, a tablet, and 30 years of experience, from the stone beneath his feet, from the people around him. Dan stood at the entrance to the mine shaft and looked out at his Greyhold, a small barony on a rocky plateau, 340 souls that had become 400, that would become 500, 1,000, more. Because there's water, there's coal, there's steel, there's copper, there's truth, and people who are willing to work for it, not to fight, to work. He took off his helmet, wiped his forehead, put the helmet back on. He walked down to the forge, because Rowan had said yesterday that a new batch of drill bits was ready, and because the borehole was waiting. And because beneath Greyhold, at a depth he didn't yet know, lay a machine that had once created magic. And Dan Crow was going to get to it. Not today, not tomorrow, but he would get there. Because that's his job, to drill, to find, to bring things to the surface, and to build something better from what he finds. He walked down the road, hard hat on his head, hands in his pockets, his stride steady. Ahead lay work. Ahead lay life. Ahead lay a world waiting to be unearthed.